Brad Pitt walked through the evening city, breathing in the cool air and enjoying the silence. Far from the noisy parties and cameras, Brad preferred moments of solitude, when he could simply stroll through empty streets and reflect on life. Soon, his gaze was drawn to a man sitting on an old bench in the park. His face was hidden under a dirty hat, and his clothes were torn, but something about this man made Brad stop. As he got closer, Brad noticed the man was older than he first appeared. His eyes, deeply sunken and dull, reflected years of loneliness and pain. He sat motionless, as if the world around him had ceased to exist. Brad, accustomed to helping people, couldn't walk past. "Hey, can I help you?" Brad asked, peering into the stranger's face. The man lifted his head, his gaze brightened for a moment, then quickly faded. He clearly wasn't used to being spoken to like this. "What do you want?" he replied, his voice hoarse and weak. Brad sat down next to him, trying not to startle him. I just wanted to know how you ended up here." The man was silent for a while, then, as if deciding he had nothing left to lose, he began to speak. His name was Michael. He had once been a successful entrepreneur, owning a small but profitable company. Everything he had disappeared after his business partners got involved in money laundering schemes. Michael had witnessed these dealings, and when he tried to distance himself from the business, his life collapsed. His relationships with family shattered, friends left, and then came the financial hole. Eventually, he found himself on the streets. "I can't go back, I've lost everything," Michael said when Brad offered to help. He shook his head, not believing his own story. Brad felt a strange connection to this man. He knew that such moments of fate didn't happen by accident. "Listen, I can't offer you my home, but I can help in another way. I'll rent you a place in a hostel for a few days so you can rest and think. You can stay there." Michael was surprised. He hadn't expected anyone to offer him such help. However, doubt quickly turned to gratitude. Brad gave him money for the hostel and directions on where to find it. "I don't want you to stay on the streets. I believe you deserve a fresh start." Michael, with uncertainty in his voice, thanked Brad. "I don't know if I can start over," he said. But Brad was already heading to his car. He was sure he had given Michael a chance, and that was all that mattered. The evening city swallowed them up, but Brad couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random encounter. Something in Michael's story seemed too significant to just leave it like that. The next day, Brad met with Michael again. He knew he couldn't just leave him alone with his problems, and decided to give him a chance. The meeting was set at the cafe where Brad usually spent his mornings. He knew Michael needed time to adjust to his new reality, and he was ready to offer help, though he wasn't sure where to start. When Michael entered the cafe, he looked a little better, though his face was still weathered and his eyes dull. He looked at Brad with gratitude, but also with a hint of disbelief, as if everything happening seemed too good to be true. "Thanks for last night," Michael began, sitting down at the table. "I didn't think anyone would even notice me. People usually just walk by." Brad smiled. "We all need help sometimes. Have you ever thought about starting over?" Michael sighed and looked out the window. He was quiet for a moment before finally speaking. "I was a successful businessman. I once had a company. My partners and I made good money, but everything collapsed when I found out they were involved in fraud. Money laundering, illegal schemes. I was too naive to see it in time. As soon as I tried to get out, they started blackmailing me. Everything went downhill, my house, my family, my job." Brad, hearing these words, knew Michael wasn't exaggerating. In a world where money and power often go hand in hand, stories like this were common. But what had happened to Michael sounded like the result of not just business failure, but personal betrayal. "What happened next?" Brad asked, setting his coffee cup aside. Michael continued, his eyes darkening with the weight of his memories. "I tried to fix it. Tried to expose them, but no one believed me. So, I decided to leave. First for a couple of weeks, then a month, and then I couldn't go back. My life was ruined, and I had nowhere to go. Brad listened in silence. He could see how difficult it was for Michael to speak about this, but he knew this story wasn't just about one person's fall. It was about how the system could destroy a life, and then leave it to fate. You said you had a home and a family, Brad said. Have you ever thought about trying to get back even a part of what you had? Michael shook his head. My family. I lost everything. My wife and kids didn't want to see me when I left. They thought I had betrayed them. I tried to fix things, but time passed. I'm not needed by anyone. The silence between them was heavy. Brad understood that it wasn't easy for Michael to believe in a chance for recovery. But deep down, he felt this man deserved a second chance. Listen, I understand it's hard for you, but maybe you'd want to try again. There's a place on my team where you won't have to fight for every day. You can work and be part of something new, Brad offered, hoping this would help Michael find a way out. Michael hesitated. I'm not sure I can go back to the world I was in before. But if you really believe in this. I believe in people, Michael. You're not the first to face hardships, and you won't be the last. It won't be easy, but I'm ready to help. Michael straightened up, and for the first time in a long while, something resembling a smile appeared on his face. Thank you. I'll think about it. After this meeting, Brad knew it was just the beginning. He didn't yet know what path awaited Michael, but he was sure he had taken the right step. Sometimes, helping someone wasn't just about solving their problem, but about showing that even in the darkest situations, there's light to be found. A few days later, Michael went to work at the hostel where he was staying. Brad continued to support him, but now he was focused on figuring out how to make his life stable. On the first day, he met Michael at the cafe, and the latter seemed a bit more confident, though his face still carried traces of disappointment and fatigue. Have you ever worked in service? Brad asked as they sat at the table. Michael thought for a moment. I used to run a company, not a cafe. But I need to work to fix my life somehow. I'm ready for anything. All right, I can help with that. There's a place that needs help. It's not a high-paying job right away, but I'm sure it'll give you a chance to get back into the rhythm of life, Brad said. He knew that Michael needed support, but he didn't want to do everything for him. A few days later, Brad took Michael to a small cafe in the city center. It wasn't a luxurious place, but it was cozy, with great service and loyal customers. Brad was a regular there, and the owners had been familiar to him for a long time. This is your chance, Michael. You can start as a barista. Allow yourself to focus on something simple and stable, Brad suggested as they entered the cafe. Michael looked at him skeptically but was grateful. He knew this wasn't his dream job, but the path to recovery had to start with something simple. The cafe owner, Edward, was a man in his 40s with a friendly smile. He welcomed Michael enthusiastically. You're looking for a job, huh? Well, let's give it a try. I've known Brad for a while, and if he recommended you, then you must be worth it, Edward said, handing Michael an apron. The first days were tough. Michael struggled to adapt to his new role. He still felt out of place, but each day brought new experiences and lessons. Brad visited the cafe almost every day to support him, talk, and remind him that all of this was just the beginning. You're doing great, Michael, he would say, watching as Michael made coffee for the first customer. Don't give up, every step brings you closer to getting your life back. But despite Brad's support, Michael faced challenges. After a few weeks of work, he still couldn't shake off the dark thoughts about his past. He feared that he would be exposed and have to explain his former life again. At times, he was pulled back into depression, and he felt as though his past, like a dark shadow, continued to haunt him. One evening, while washing dishes in the cafe, a young man approached, someone who recognized Michael. His eyes narrowed when he saw him, and then, with a smirk, he said, "I thought you were lost forever. Aren't you going to give up after all those stories with your partners?" Michael froze, his heart racing. He felt all his fears and doubts waking up again. For a moment, it seemed like the whole world would turn against him once more. He didn't know how to react. But Brad, who was always there, didn't let Michael give up. He walked over to them and calmly said, "Do you want to apologize to him? Why don't you just leave?" The man became flustered and quickly left without saying another word. After the incident, Michael stayed in the cafe until late, sitting in a corner, lost in thought. He still felt lost, but Brad didn't leave him. He came to the cafe later and sat next to him. "Don't pay attention to people like that," Brad said. "You deserve more than their words. You've already made the decision to start over, and no one can change that. The most important thing is that you believe in yourself." Michael looked at him, and in his eyes, Brad saw a spark he hadn't seen in a long time. He didn't know what the future would bring, but one thing was clear: he was no longer the person who had sat on a bench in the park, hoping someone would notice him. Now he had a chance, and he was ready to fight for it. With each passing day, Michael grew more confident in his new life. He began participating in discussions with colleagues, learning to make complex coffee drinks, and his confidence grew. One day, Brad noticed how Michael was talking to regular customers and realized that he was no longer the person who had sat on a bench a year ago. A month later, after Michael had reintegrated into the work process, he decided to do something else that could speed up his recovery. He enrolled in financial management courses. He knew that his previous work in business hadn't been a coincidence, and now he wanted to reclaim the experience he had once lost. That same day, Michael wrote to a former colleague from his old company. He didn't know how the person would respond, but he was ready for any answer. "Hi, Andre, I know a lot of time has passed, but I want to apologize. Not just to you, but to myself. I realize I was wrong, but I want to make it right. I'd be glad to hear from you when you have time." In response, he received a short but warm message. "Hi, Michael. We all make mistakes. I'm glad to see you back on your feet. Don't give up." This was the first confirmation that his steps weren't in vain. Brad saw how Michael had begun to truly rebuild his life. He was no longer the person who had once lost everything. He was now ready to start over. Michael was still striving for a new life. He worked hard at the cafe, learning financial schemes and mastering new skills. Everything seemed perfect, but old habits, hidden fears, and most importantly, uncertainty, never let him go. He couldn't understand why he still felt as though something important was slipping away from him. One evening, as Michael was leaving the cafe, he was met by the same man in the expensive suit, Richard Dane. This time, his smile was wider, and his eyes less friendly. "Michael," he said with a barely perceptible accent. "You haven't changed a bit. Do you think you've left it all behind?" Michael froze, feeling a chill in his stomach. Everything he had once tried to forget came rushing back with this man. He tried to pretend he didn't understand what he was talking about. "What do you want?" Michael's voice shook, despite his efforts to keep it steady. Richard looked him over carefully, as if seeing everything hidden behind the facade. "I don't think you believe in your new life. You know as well as I do, Michael, that the past doesn't just disappear. These aren't just words. You owe us." But despite the growing tension, Michael refused to back down. "I don't want anything to do with you. Got it?" He could feel his heart racing. Richard silently looked him in the eye, then threw out a phrase that made Michael momentarily forget where he was. "You're not running from us, Michael. You just haven't realized yet that you're part of our game." Michael felt the conversation stretch out, like a web tightening around his throat. He didn't know who was telling the truth, but he was sure Richard was hiding something. In that moment, he wanted to run, but something kept him there. Everything on the surface seemed so transparent, almost absurd. What if Richard wasn't the enemy, but some unexpected ally? But with every word, that question became more and more complicated. After Richard left, Michael returned to his small cafe. He tried to collect himself, but couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed something important. He sat in the shadows, lost in his thoughts, when he suddenly felt someone's gaze. From across the room, a woman was staring at him. Brad had always told him not to get involved with strangers, but Michael couldn't ignore her cold yet persistent stare. She was beautiful, but something in her expression made his heart tighten. The woman stood up, approached him, and quietly said, "You don't know everything, Michael. Your past mistakes are just the beginning. Don't think you can run away. We're all watching you." He froze. How did she know his name? He couldn't respond. Only when she disappeared into the crowd did he feel his palms sweating. That same evening, Brad noticed that something was off. Michael had become nervous, too on edge. He tried to hide his anxiety, but Brad wasn't foolish. He knew Michael was hiding something. "What's going on?" Brad asked, trying to understand. "Nothing. Just a lot of work, that's all," Michael said, but his gaze wandered, as if he was trying to conceal something bigger. But Brad couldn't shake the feeling that Michael was up to something. He didn't know why it seemed so important, but he sensed that Michael was hiding something far more dangerous than just his past. The next morning, Brad decided to call his old friend, Alex, a detective. Alex was the kind of person who always helped when things got out of control. Brad knew his information could be useful, but even his voice on the phone didn't promise anything good. "Are you sure this guy is who you think he is?" Alex asked. "I don't want to cast doubts, but Michael has connections you can't even imagine. And his past is much deeper than you think." Brad was stunned. He had always thought Michael was just a guy trying to start over. But what if his story wasn't quite what it seemed? Every step Michael took now seemed suspicious. Who was right? What if everything that had happened to Michael was just a fragment of a much larger game, and he wasn't just a pawn but a puppet? When Brad returned to the cafe, he found Michael in the corner. But this time, Michael was a completely different person. He stared out the window, not noticing anyone around him. His eyes were full of emptiness, as if he himself were lost. Brad approached him, but Michael didn't notice him. "Michael?" Brad quietly called him. But Michael only flinched and answered disinterestedly. "I don't know how much longer I can keep going like this. This isn't the life I dreamed of." Only then did Brad realize that things weren't as simple as they seemed. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew one thing: everything they had built, everything Michael had been through, might just be an illusion, and something far darker lay at the root of his past mistakes. Michael could no longer ignore the growing anxiety that had been building up inside him every day. His life was falling apart once again, and Brad, though trying to support him, was becoming a part of this tangled game. Inside, Michael felt that he had reached a dead end, that his past would never leave him alone, no matter how hard he tried to start fresh. The moment came when he could no longer hide the truth. Brad noticed that his friend had become tired, with dull eyes. Something was wrong. He decided to talk to him, but as soon as he approached Michael, he withdrew. "Are you okay?" Brad asked quietly, trying to avoid too many questions. But Michael just nodded silently and turned away. At that moment, Brad suddenly realized that Michael had started hiding something important from him. Maybe it wasn't just his inner demons, but something far more dangerous. In the cafe where Michael worked, it had become genuinely cold. He had long noticed the strange behavior of the customers, odd people who came and went, as if undercover. Every step they took seemed calculated, every look was expectant. But when Michael returned from his night shift, he realized this wasn't a coincidence. That man in the expensive suit, Richard Dane, had appeared in the cafe again. This time he was with someone. A woman, with a gaze that made it clear she was someone significant. She seemed calm, but there was something in her presence that made Michael feel this moment was a point of no return. "Do you still think you can keep playing your game?" Richard asked as Michael approached the table. His voice was cold, and there was none of the previous confidence. He was on the verge of making some unpredictable decision. Michael began to understand that his life wasn't just a random sequence of events. "What do you want?" Michael tried to remain calm, but couldn't hide his concern. He realized that this wasn't the moment to just pretend everything was fine. Richard smirked, but there was a coldness in his eyes that Michael hadn't noticed before. "You don't understand what's going on, do you? We're not just going to leave you alone, Michael. You were part of something much bigger, and you can't just walk away from this like a game. You have to make a choice." Michael felt his heart tighten. His mind was spinning. "What choice?" "I don't owe you anything," he said with strained resolve, but even he wasn't sure of his own words. "You've always been ours, Michael. You were and will always be part of what we built." "You just didn't know it," Richard said, and there was neither fear nor regret in his voice. It was like a quiet acceptance of a fate Michael couldn't escape. With every word, Michael's confidence in the idea that his life had truly changed began to fade. He never thought he was part of something bigger than just a random person who had ended up on the street. Now he saw how his past was consuming him. The woman in the expensive dress stepped closer. "You thought you could run from us, but we're always around," she said quietly. Her words sounded like a prophecy, as if her voice was the voice of destiny. Michael felt his mind close in on itself, as though the world around him had begun to dull. Glimpsing at Brad, Michael saw that he didn't say anything, didn't intervene, but his eyes were full of concern. He knew something had happened, something out of the ordinary. Michael approached Brad, distancing himself from Richard and the woman. "You don't need to be involved in this, Brad," he said, his voice trembling. "I'm confused, and I can't explain it all to you. But you shouldn't know. They've always been around, and I can't escape." Brad looked at him. He saw how Michael was falling apart before his eyes. Everything they had built together, everything he had believed in, was becoming unclear and tangled. He wanted to help, but didn't know what to do in a world full of shadows. "Michael, you're not alone. We're with you. We'll get through this together," Brad said, and although his words sounded convincing, he himself wasn't sure he believed them. The shadows of Michael's past, which tormented him, began to envelop Brad as well. He understood that if Michael couldn't escape this web, they would all be drawn into something much more dangerous than they could imagine. Michael silently looked at him and turned away. He was alone. And despite Brad's best efforts, he knew he couldn't avoid what was inevitable. There was always that moment in life when the past hit you with such force that there was no room left for choice. And in that moment, Michael understood, he would not escape. This was his cross to bear, and his path was not just his own.